The heavy iron doors slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, swallowing the last flickers of the medieval world. It was the early hours of Friday, October 13, 1307, a date that would eventually be etched into the collective memory of the world as a mark of misfortune. In a single coordinated sweep, the most powerful warriors in Europe were transformed from protectors of the faith into hunted fugitives within the very lands they had sworn to defend. They were the Knights Templar, men who had commanded vast armies and managed the complex finances of kingdoms, now facing a shadow they could not strike down with a sword. The suddenness of the betrayal sent shockwaves across the continent, leaving a question that would linger for 7 centuries. How did the defenders of the Holy Land find themselves trapped in the damp, lightless cells of an Inquisition they once served? The transition from the battlefield to the dungeon was not a matter of military failure, but of a shifting political landscape where debt and influence became more dangerous than any foreign enemy. For decades, the Templars had acted as the primary bankers of Europe, holding the keys to the wealth of kings. They were an international force, answering only to the Pope, an arrangement that had served them well until the balance of power began to tip. When a ruler finds himself deeply indebted to a force that exists outside his legal reach, the relationship shifts from one of alliance to one of existential threat. King Philip IV of France, burdened by financial ruin and seeking absolute control over his realm, began to view the order not as a spiritual shield, but as a mountain of gold that needed to be dismantled and absorbed. Inside the limestone walls of the interrogation chambers, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of mildew and the metallic tang of old-bought blood. These were men trained to endure the scorching heat of the desert and the brutal chaos of the Crusades. Yet the psychological pressure of isolation began to wear down even the most hardened spirits. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, mimicking the shifting accusations being leveled against them. The interrogators did not seek a dialogue. They sought a script that had already been written in the halls of the royal court. The goal was to extract admissions of heresy, secret rituals, and betrayals of the faith that would justify the total dissolution of the order and the seizure of its vast assets. Under systematic pressure, the boundary between truth and survival began to blur. Day after day, the knights were subjected to methods of coercion designed to shatter the mind rather than just the body. They were kept in total darkness for weeks, deprived of sleep and fed only enough to keep them conscious for the next round of questioning. The silence of the cells was often broken by the rhythmic dripping of water or the distant muffled sound of a brother breaking under the weight of his own despair. The conflict was no longer on a physical field with clear banners and defined enemies, but within the fractured psyche of the accused. If they remained silent, they faced an indefinite end in the dark. If they spoke the words the inquisitors wanted to hear, they might see the sun again, even if it meant tarnishing the reputation of the brotherhood they had sworn to protect with their lives. The confessions that eventually emerged from these deep cells were as bizarre as they were consistent, reading like a fever dream of medieval anxieties. Knights admitted to spitting on the cross during initiation, worshipping a mysterious horned idol known as Baphomet, and engaging in secretive ceremonies that defied the doctrines of the Church. Yet historical analysis often looks at these records with deep skepticism. Why would a group of men who had spent their lives defending the faith suddenly turn toward practices that would ensure their absolute destruction? The records suggest that these admissions were not reflections of a hidden reality, but the result of unrelenting duress applied by those who stood to gain the most from the Templars' fall. The script was the weapon, and the dungeon was the forge. As the trials dragged on, a strange phenomenon began to occur within the damp confines of the prison. While some nights were crushed by the weight of the interrogation, others found a cold, hard clarity in their predicament. There were those who, after initially confessing to save themselves from the immediate agony of the rack or the boot, later recanted their statements in public. They claimed that their words had been bought with pain, and that the accusations were entirely fabricated by a king desperate for gold. These men knew the price of their defiance. By taking back their confessions, they were sealing their fate as relapsed heretics, a designation that carried the ultimate penalty under the law of the time. They chose to face the end with their integrity intact, rather than live a life constructed from a royal lie. The conflict between the French crown and the papacy added a layer of geopolitical chess to the tragedy. Pope Clement V, while initially hesitant to move against an order that was the direct military arm of the Church, found himself caught between the political maneuvers of King Philip and the internal pressure of a fracturing institution. The trial was not just about the guilt or innocence of a few thousand knights. It was a battle for the soul of European authority. If the king could successfully dismantle an international organization like the Templars, it would signal a shift where secular national power began to eclipse the universal influence of the Church. The knights were the pawns, their lives traded for the consolidation of a crown. In the deepest shadows of the dungeon, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, faced his own internal struggle. Having led the order through its most challenging years of retreat from the Holy Land, he now watched as his life's work was systematically dismantled by ink and iron. The records of his early interrogation show a man who fluctuated between defiance and a soul-crushing despair. The weight of responsibility for the thousands of men under his command must have been unbearable. He was a veteran of 100 battles, yet here, his enemy was a piece of parchment and a king he had once called a friend. When he was finally brought out of the darkness for what would be his final public appearance, his voice, though aged and raspy from years of confinement, did not waver. He rejected the false confessions, asserted the purity of the order, and looked directly into the face of his accusers. The mystery of what happened to the Templar wealth and their most sensitive documents remains one of the great puzzles of the era. On the night of the arrests, it is whispered that several wagons heavily guarded by a few remaining loyalists slipped out of Paris, heading toward the coast or the deep forests of the north. Did they carry the records that could have proven their innocence, or perhaps evidence of the very secrets the king was desperate to uncover? The void left by the disappearing archives has fueled centuries of speculation, but the truth remains locked in the silence of the past. The king's agents found less gold than they expected, leading to a frantic search that lasted years. But the treasure of the Templars seemed to have evaporated along with their legal status. The methods used by the Inquisition were designed to ensure that no one could remain neutral. The environment was engineered to create a sense of total helplessness, where the only escape was to provide the narrative the authorities demanded. This systematic breaking of the human will serves as a dark chapter in the history of legal and religious proceedings. It highlights a period where the pursuit of a specific political outcome overrode the search for objective truth, leading to the destruction of an institution that had been a pillar of medieval society for 200 years. The very walls of the cells were carved with the graffiti of the condemned, symbols of faith, crosses, and names left as the only testimony for men who had been stripped of their right to their own reality. Even as the fires were prepared for those who refused to maintain their false confessions, a sense of unease settled over the people of Paris. The sight of seasoned warriors, men who had survived the heat of the East, being led to their end for crimes that seemed impossible to many, created a rift in the public consciousness. Was it possible that an entire organization could fall so far? Or was the world witnessing a massive, orchestrated silencing of an inconvenient power? The ambiguity of the evidence and the brutal nature of the confessions left a stain on the era that no royal decree could wash away. The public execution of the leadership was intended to be a final punctuation mark, a closing of the book on the Templar legacy. The final moments of the order were marked by a legendary defiance. It is said that as the flames began to rise around Jacques de Molay on a small island in the Seine, he issued a final summons to those who had orchestrated his downfall. He called upon King Philip and Pope Clement to meet him before the divine judgment within a year. Whether by a strange alignment of fate or something more mysterious, both the king and the pope passed away shortly after the execution. This final act turned the tragedy into a legend, ensuring that the Knights Templar would not be remembered as defeated heretics, but as victims of a calculated and ruthless power struggle. The Grand Master's final words echoed longer than the king's laws. The legacy of the dungeons is not found in the gold that was seized or the lands that were redistributed, but in the questions that remain unanswered. The trial of the Templars serves as a historical warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the ease with which the truth can be manipulated under the guise of security and tradition. It reminds us that when power is used to silence dissent and force agreement, the resulting truth is often nothing more than a reflection of the interrogator's own desires. The silence of the stone cells speaks to the endurance of the human spirit under the most extreme conditions, and the markings on the walls remain as a quiet, enduring protest against a system that demanded they betray everything that they believed in. Today, the sites where the knights were held remain as silent witnesses to those years of darkness. The atmosphere in these places still feels heavy, as if the stones themselves absorbed the desperation and the resolve of the prisoners. The story of the Templars is often shrouded in myth and romanticism, but at its core, it is a dark thriller of political intrigue and psychological warfare. It is a narrative of how quickly the world can turn on those it once celebrated, and how the walls of a dungeon can become the final battlefield for the human soul. The conflict between the need for truth and the pressure to conform is a timeless struggle, and the echoes of the Templars' confessions still resonate as a reminder of the price of integrity in an age of shadows. As we look back at the documents and the ruins of that era, we are forced to confront the reality that history is often written by the victors, but the truth lives in the gaps they left behind. The Knights Templar were dismantled, their names tarnished, and their wealth scattered, yet their story continues to captivate the imagination. It is a story that asks us to consider what we would do when faced with a choice between a comfortable lie and a fatal truth, and whether the silence of the dungeon is louder than the proclamations of a king. The trial was the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a centuries-long quest to uncover what really happened behind those closed doors. The shadows of the Inquisition may have faded, but the mechanisms of influence and the tactics of psychological pressure remain relevant. The trial of the Templars was not an isolated incident of the Middle Ages, but a demonstration of how systems of power can be weaponized against individuals. By examining the darkness of those cells, we gain a clearer understanding of the fragility of justice and the enduring strength of those who refuse to be broken, even when the world seems determined to erase them from history. The final chapter of the Templars was not written in the blood of the battlefield, but in the soot of the final pyres and the ink of the Inquisitor's scrolls. Consider the sensory reality of a knight who once stood at the gates of Jerusalem, now reduced to counting the drips of water from a ceiling in the dark. The clatter of the jailer's keys was the only herald of a world that had moved on without him. Each interrogation session was a battle of attrition, not of swords, but of narratives. The Inquisitors, meticulously recording every stuttered word, were the architects of a new reality. They constructed a labyrinth of lies so dense that even the strongest spirit could lose its way. This was not a trial for the sake of justice. It was a ritual of erasure, designed to ensure that the Templars would cease to exist, both in the physical world and in the records of history. Yet the erasure was incomplete. The very brutality of the king's methods ensured that the Templars would become martyrs. The spectacle of the fires in Paris did not extinguish the order's influence. It merely transformed it. In the centuries that followed, the Templars became a symbol of secret knowledge, lost treasure, and the eternal struggle against tyranny. The darkness of the dungeons provided a fertile ground for the growth of legends that would outlast the French monarchy itself. The irony of the Inquisition is that in trying to destroy the Templars, they granted them a form of immortality that no military victory ever could. In the end, the stone walls of the dungeons have outlasted the kingdoms that built them. The confessions, extracted through duress and later retracted in the face of death, serve as a testament to the fact that while a body can be imprisoned, the essence of a person's conviction remains beyond the reach of any interrogator. The dark thriller of the Templars continues, a mystery wrapped in the cold embrace of history, waiting for the light of objective truth to finally break through the shadows. The knights may have been silenced, but the questions they left behind in the dark continue to demand an answer centuries after the fires have cooled and the iron doors have rusted away. The silence is not an absence of sound, but a heavy, expectant presence, a reminder that the truth is often buried beneath layers of political convenience, waiting for a voice brave enough to speak it.